What do all the specifications mean, and do you really need a liquid cooler? Welcome back to FCW Tech. I'm your host Isaiah, and today I'm going to be going over everything you need to know basically about CPU coolers, so air and liquid, all the specifications and what they mean, how you can choose, and just how they work in general. So let's get right into it. So I'm doing TLDRs now. I mean, they're actually TLDWs, because like watch instead of read, because it's a video. So I'm doing these now. If you have a short attention span, sure you'll love these. So bottom line of the video, I'm just going to tell you what the conclusion basically is. Then I'm going to go more in depth for those of you who really want to learn a lot. So basically what you need to know is big tower coolers will suffice for high-end chips, and they perform on par with 240mm or even some 360mm AIOs. Only consider an AIO smaller than 240mm if you have an ITX PC. Static pressure fans are always better for CPU coolers than airflow fans. Make sure you stay under 45 decibels and 90 degrees Celsius. Under 45 decibels for the noise level of your cooler and under 90 for your CPU temperature. You should use a push-pull fan configuration for optimal thermals and efficiency. Get some good thermal paste. Check for case, motherboard, and RAM compatibility. So that's the TLDW, right? That's like the very quick thing, condensed down. If you want to leave the video now, feel free. But if you really want to learn about CPU coolers, stick around. So let's get into it. Whether you decide to go with air or liquid cooling, it's always important to keep your CPU at a safe operating temperature, especially when you're overclocking. So the way CPU coolers work, and the way they do this, is by absorbing heat from the CPU and they take it away from the chip. So the heat from the chip is transferred to the metal top of the CPU, which is called the integrated heat spreader, or IHS. The heat then goes to the base plate of the CPU cooler, connected to the IHS with thermal paste. Then the heat is distributed through either heat pipes or by liquid to fans that exhaust the air out of the system. So as we all know, there are two main forms of CPU coolers, air coolers and liquid coolers. And then within the liquid cooling segment, you've got two options. You've got all-in-one coolers, or AIOs, and you've got custom liquid cooling, hardline tubing, soft tubing, all that. But custom liquid cooling is not my specialty, so we're going to stick to AIOs for liquid cooling in this piece. So we'll start with air coolers. There are a few types of air cooler form factors. You've got low profile, tower, and mega tower. Coolers like the AMD Wraith Stealth are low profile despite not being advertised as such, because in reality they're cheap, and when they're really cheap, they're really small, and they tend to go with like a more low profile design. But they're not like meant to be low profile, they're just meant to be cheap to produce and free with the CPUs. So some more mid-range coolers like Noctua's L9A-AM4 advertise their low-profile design. So low-profile coolers are generally more long than they are tall, right? In terms of when it's on the motherboard, well, on the CPU on the motherboard. Whereas tower coolers extend out from the motherboard in a vertical fashion. So if I've got the motherboard here, if my hand is the motherboard, right? A tower cooler will be more like this, more tall. And a low-profile cooler will be low to the motherboard, but maybe a little bit longer. Maybe not even longer. I mean, it really depends. So it depends how many fans and how big the heat sinks are on the tower cooler, all that. Tower coolers, like the Cooler Master Hyper 212 series, have 1 or 2 heat sinks as well as 1 or 2 visible fans. Mega tower coolers are massive tower coolers covered in plastic shrouds. This usually renders the fans virtually invisible. I mean, not really, but it's harder to see the fans, and they're really not like a main focus of it. Think the Cooler Master MA620M, which I have on screen right now. Generally speaking, the bulkier the heatsink, the better the cooling performance. CPU temperatures are safe under 90 degrees Celsius, and ideally they'd be under 80. If you reach an unsafe temperature, your CPU will throttle and lose performance to stay at a safe temperature, so make sure you get a decent cooler. You also want to make sure that your cooler doesn't run too loudly. You want to stay around 40 decibels in the noise department, probably. As the noise level of a cooler is not a rated specification on coolers, you'll want to watch, YouTube reviews and read reviews with temperature and noise testing to make sure that it's a good cooler in terms of that as well. With air coolers, you want to make sure that the fans equipped with your coolers are adequate. So static pressure fans are superior to airflow fans for tower cooler use because they're better for pushing air through obstructed spaces like heat sinks or radiators. If the fans you're looking at don't say whether they're static pressure or airflow, just know that static pressure fans are usually, they have a few blades, a few fan blades, and they're more flat. The blades look more flat, whereas with airflow fans, there will be more blades and they'll be angled more. So in general, low profile coolers work by, they move air via a fan on top of a heatsink, which faces outwards from the CPU. However, a few low-profile coolers like the Alpenphone Blackridge have a fan between the heatsink and the cold plate, which pull air up from the chip with the help of heat pipes. So cold plate is the same as a base plate. It's like the copper surface that is at the bottom of your CPU, you know, where the heat sinks or the heat pipes meet together. Tower coolers with one heat sink and two fans, or two heat sinks with basically no space in between for a fan, like in the case of the Scythe Ninja 5, often use a push-pull fan configuration in which the fans face in the same direction on the outside of the heat sink or heat sinks, with one fan pushing air into the heat sink from the front of the case and the other pulling it out the other way towards the back. The fans have to be oriented in the same direction, and if they are oriented in the same direction, that means you've got a push-pull configuration on an air cooler. Coolers with two smaller heat sinks also use a push-pull configuration with one fan in the front and one between the two heat sinks, both facing towards the front of the case, like with the blades facing towards the front of the case, like the front. You know how on the back of the fan, a lot of the times, there'll be like the company logo, there'll be like an X kind of like black plastic on the back. That's how you know it's the back of the fan usually. So the fans usually, like the front of the fan faces towards the front of the case, but they're really moving air to the back of the case. Tower coolers with one heat sink and one fan, as opposed to two, run a push configuration with one fan blowing air through the heat sink towards the back of the case. Pretty much no coolers use a pull configuration in which the case fan or fans would be oriented to pull air towards the back of the case. The fan or the fans, they look backwards. They would look like they're oriented backwards. And no coolers exhaust air towards the front of the case. I don't want to get too in-depth about case fans until I do that specific piece on case fans, but the main types of fan bearings from worst to best are sleeve, ball, and then fluid dynamic / hydro. So if you want to know the quality of the fan on the cooler, you could look at reviews for the fans, or you could check the bearings as well, you know, to see if they are quality. You should check if your CPU cooler comes with thermal paste. This could come in a small tube in the packaging, or could be pre-applied to the cooler. If it doesn't come with thermal paste, make sure to get paste, like the Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut, because a good thermal paste will lower CPU temperatures by a few degrees. Even if it does come with paste, check to see if the performance of the paste is good, and like thermals are good by default. If it's not good paste, you could still get separate paste because it's very cheap. I mean, Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut, you get one tube for like $8, $9. Not too bad. I don't recommend liquid metal because while it will deliver great thermals at first, even better than traditional thermal paste, it'll dry out in a few months. So unless you're really committed to changing out that thermal paste every few months, or I shouldn't even really call liquid metal thermal paste, it's like thermal metal. It's kind of different, but I probably wouldn't recommend it just because you'd have to replace it every few months or else thermals would get pretty bad. Furthermore, make sure you look for the rated thermal design power, or a TDP, of your CPU, and find a cooler with a TDP rated at least as high. So if your CPU is rated for like needing 105 watts of power, you'll want a CPU cooler that can handle a 105 watt CPU or better. So generally speaking, a $30 cooler will be perfectly adequate for a Ryzen 3 or 5, or a comparable Intel Core i3 or i5, perhaps the Deepcool Gamax 400 V2 or the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo V2. The stock cooler that comes with your CPU will also suffice for lower end chips like Ryzen 3s or Core i3s, and i5s and Ryzen 5s, as long as you don't plan to overclock your CPU. So people like to hate on stock coolers, but they're really not that bad. I mean, they're pretty bad, but you can get by with them for a while. You should probably check for coolers around the $50 mark for a Ryzen 7 or Core i7. My recommendations would be like the Arctic Freezer 34 Esports Duo, which I personally own, and the Scythe Mugen 5 Revision B. So you technically, like, if you've got like a 3700X or a 3800X, You can actually get by with the Wraith Prism just fine. Even a 3900X, the Wraith Prism's fine. But the new Zen 3 chips, the 5600X comes with a cooler in the box, whereas the 5800X and the 5900X don't. The 5950X, they don't come with a cooler, so yeah. If you have a top-tier consumer CPU, like a 10900K, the only coolers that can handle monsters like that are like top-tier options. And by the way, the 5950X, it doesn't get as hot as you might expect. So it actually has kind of similar thermals to like a 3700X, 5800X, whatever. So the bare minimum for like a 10900K would be the Scythe Fuma 2, but if you want to go with an air cooler, I would recommend something more like the Noctua NHD15, which, as they say, is a chonker. So now we're going to move on to AIO water coolers. So they come in 6 main radiator sizes, ranging from least expensive to most expensive, generally speaking. These are 120mm, 140mm, 240mm, 280mm, 360mm, and 420mm. So 140, 280, and 420mm coolers are relatively niche at this point. So most people stick to 120, 240, and 360. The same reasoning for static pressure fans also applies to AIO radiator fans, as I briefly mentioned earlier. AIOs have more points of failure than air coolers, so make sure you get a reliable cooler. For example, some Cooler Master AIOs have had issues with leakage, while Enermax coolers have suffered from internal bacteria growth. Yeah, that's pretty disgusting, and I would not want that in my cooler. Again, that's just some models for both. I'm not saying steer clear of Cooler Master and Enermax, right? Don't take that out of context. Just some of them. So some of the lower end Cooler Master ones, like the ML240LV2, have had that issue. Or the Enermax, what was it called? The Lick Tech series. Not the Lick Max, but the Lick Tech. But I believe they fixed that, actually. Make sure you mount your AIO to the top of the inside of your case if you want the best performance. That applies to ATX or micro ATX cases, so full tower, mid tower, whatever, micro ATX, mid tower, mini tower. So front mounted AIO configurations are okay, while back and bottom mounts are terrible, and bottom mounts can actually cause air bubbles in the tubes and also strange noises. Just not great for reliability. That more applies to like small form factor PCs, right? You normally wouldn't mount an AIO on the bottom, but try to do the top if you can, and if you can't, try to mount it in the front of your case. Back and bottom are just bad. So by the way, fan configurations also apply to AIOs, so like push-pull. You should try to run a push-pull configuration in your case with about as many fans intaking air as there are exhaust fans on the top and back. So you'll want about as many front intake fans as top and back exhaust fans, if not more intake fans, right? You can run a system with more intake fans than exhaust, but I would not recommend running more exhaust than intake. Definitely would not recommend that. So generally speaking, the only time people use 120mm AIOs is in small form factor builds, like ITX builds. Many ITX cases cannot support beefy air coolers or large radiators, so 120mm AIOs may be optimal. However, I would not recommend them as their cooling performance is often comparable to cheaper $40 air coolers. If you absolutely must get a small AIO like this, get the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2120 as it's priced reasonably. However, you could also get a low profile air cooler as well. They'd be priced around the same amount though, so there's really no difference between some of the higher end low profile coolers like the Noctua ones and the 120mm AIOs. I think they perform pretty similarly, so you could go either way there. 240mm AIOs start around $80, and they're good for chips like the 10700K or 5900X. However, the best 240mm AIOs can indeed cool the best consumer chips as well, so like the 10900K. My pick would be the Deepcool Captain 240 RGB V2 because it has Deepcool's anti-leak technology and it only costs $80. So the anti-leak technology, by the way, it's great. From Deepcool, it's a proprietary technology and it reduces leakage in AIOs, which leakage is a big issue because it can short out your parts. It can, fall, if your cooler's leaking, that water can fall onto your power supply, can fall onto your graphics card. You don't want that. And that cooler that I just mentioned from Deepcool, it only costs $80. So it's not a top tier contender thermally, even compared to other 240mm AIOs. It's just that anti-leak technology that's great. And it's one of the cheapest 240mm AIOs from a reputable company as well. Make sure you're getting it from a reputable company. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, but you don't want to buy it from like Raid Max or, Rygen Tech or sources like that. You want to stick to the more reputable brands that are going to do a good job. So 360mm AIOs can cool the most mighty of chips, including Threadrippers and stuff like that. So there are so many phenomenal AIOs out there, like the Cooler Master MLR series, the Arctic Liquid Freezer 2 series, the Deep Cool Coolers with Anti-Leak, the EK AIO series, Leanne Lee Galahad series, and more. However, due to the outstanding reliability of Corsair coolers and its good performance, I'll give the 360mm crown to the IQ H150i Elite Capellix from Corsair. And when I say legendary reliability and performance of their coolers, I refer to their AIOs, not the A500. So yeah, make sure you avoid the A500 for sure. Unless it's on sale on Newegg for like $27, $28. That actually happens sometimes. So yeah, pretty crazy. So now that you've learned about both main types of CPU cooling, there are a few things you should also know. So make sure your cooler is compatible with your case, motherboard, and RAM. Many cases can't support 360mm AIOs or really tall CPU coolers, so make sure that you check the compatibility specifications. Additionally, some CPU coolers like the famous Arctic Freezer 34 Esports Duo come with mounting hardware that's not compatible with every motherboard of a specific generation. So there isn't much way to check your compatibility within chipsets, but make sure your motherboard chipset is supposed to be compatible with the cooler. You may end up having to separately source mounting hardware in like a worst case scenario. Another factor to consider is that tower coolers, including mega towers, often overhang your RAM sticks. Make sure your RAM is not so tall that it'll interfere with your cooler. Most coolers have a specification you can check for maximum RAM height. Be sure to check out reviews to find out how easy or difficult your cooler is to install. If you're a tech reviewer like I am and you have to switch out coolers a lot and stuff, that could be important for you. And switching out, I mean, that applies to all the parts, really. The modularity and the ease of installation, it's always nice. Could save you a few minutes of annoyance as well just during the building process, even if you're not a tech reviewer. Even though you'd have to spend minutes watching or reading reviews on it anyways, but, you know. Also, remember that you can always upgrade the fans that come with your AIO or cooler if you like. Some fans are bigger and therefore usually better than others. However, larger fans than 120mm fans are often not compatible with coolers. If they are, consider them, though. Like 140mm fans, they're better than 120mm fans, of course. So, like, for example, a 420mm radiator has 3 140mm fans. That's just an example. Finally, make sure you know what you're getting yourself into with RGB. So, RGB looks great, but understand that RGB equals more annoying connectors and more cable management as well. So that'll be it. Hopefully, you now have a greater understanding of how to choose the best CPU cooler for you. Remember that not one method is always cooler, quieter, or better than another. People like to make generalizations like liquid coolers are, you know, quieter than air coolers. That's not always true. It really depends. So make sure you watch as many cooler reviews as possible, and then you will know which ones are the best for you and the best overall, and hopefully you'll be able to be happy with your purchase. So I hope you enjoyed the video. That was Isaiah with FTW Tech, and yeah, see you guys.